Welcome. Welcome to everybody to the 2023 International Summit on the Teaching Profession. We are thrilled to have you here, and we hope that this is an enjoyable time for you in Washington, D.C., as well as a productive time in our discussion. So welcome, and let's kick off. But before I get started, I want to mention one logistical thing. You have headsets at your seat. So if you need them, we have translation in multiple languages. You can see it on the translation channel. So, okay, I am Maureen McLaughlin. I am a senior advisor to Secretary Cardona and the Director of International Affairs at the Department of Education. Many of you who have attended international summits on the teaching profession in the past are used to the person sitting in this seat being Anthony McKay. Unfortunately, due to surgery and instructions from his doctor, he was unable to travel here at the last minute. So you have me instead. He sends his best wishes and wishes he was here with us. It is an honor for the United States to host this 13th International Summit on the Teaching Profession. The United States helped to kick off and create the first summit in 2011 in New York City, and then hosted again in 2012. When we first started that, we really didn't know that this would become an annual convening with high demand, high interest, and real impact. So we are thrilled to host in person Secretary Cardona, along with our co-hosts, Education International and OECD. Secretary Cardona also hosted virtually in 2021, but this is an extra honor to have you all here in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. As I think all of you know, this is a unique forum. The International Summit on the Teaching Profession is the only forum that brings together ministers of education, secretaries of education, with union leaders, with representatives of the teaching profession at the same table, at the same time, for open and constructive dialogue. And that really is, I think, part of the reason, or main reason, why this has been such a successful and continuing endeavor. And this international learning, all of us learning from each other about what we are doing and what are the best ways or different ways to elevate and enhance the teaching profession, to improve teaching and learning, is the reason we are all here. It is students, it is young people, it is older people, it is improving teaching and learning in each of our countries and across the globe. It also has a major implication for each of our individual countries because the delegations work together while here and make commitments each year of things that they will work on over the next year and report back in the next summit. So there's a really important combination of intentional collaboration, international learning, and learning among each of the country delegations. So today we have 22 countries, including the United States, participating in the International Summit on the Teaching Profession. This is an increase over recent years when we had about 15 countries. So you're a big group, and we're excited to have you all here. And it does mean that we need people when we have the interventions from countries in discussion, in the discussion sessions, we will need people to be crisp and short in interventions in order to be able to get dialogue across everybody. So for some of you, this is your first time at an international summit on the teaching profession. For some of you, you've been maybe every year or at least some years. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the guidelines and how the program is structured before we get going. So the opening and closing session, this is the opening session, are open to the press, and we have press here with us. And then today we have a special guest, the First Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden, will join us for the beginning of session 1. So we are very excited about that. That will also be open press. Then we will move into 3 sessions on each of the sub-themes that will be operated under Chatham House rules, and we will not have press in the room. The reason for that is we want to be able to have people not feel inhibited in the discussion and in the sort of very, very open and constructive dialogue that each of us is undertaking. And again, as I mentioned before, countries meet, so you will all meet tomorrow before lunch to commit to a set of actions that you will work on over the next year. And then in the closing session, each of you will report back on those commitments. We'll give you some more instructions of how to do that later, but it will be a very, very quick presentation of what your commitments are. So let me just kick us off and move right into the session now, which is our theme for this year for the International Summit on the Teaching Profession is Transformative Teaching for Global Engagement, Sustainability, and Digital Access. And under that important theme, we have three sub-themes. One is elevating and enhancing the teaching profession. Another is educating for global and cultural competence, for civic engagement and democracy. And a third is working on digital access and enhancement for learning. So those are our three sub-themes. Obviously, they're interrelated to each other, but we will have one session of open discussion on each of those topics. Secretary Cardona will host and moderate the session on the teaching profession. Susan Hopgood from Education International will host and moderate the session on global and cultural competence, and Andreas Schleicher from the OECD will moderate the session on digital learning. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning and thank you. Welcome to the 2023 International Summit on the Teaching Profession. I want to thank Maureen for her great work, not only filling in for Anthony, but doing a great job helping prepare for this summit. I wish Anthony well. I wish you a speedy recovery, and I'm glad you're listening to your doctors. And I want to welcome the teams from the various countries that are here. I know it is a significant sacrifice to travel for this long, to be away for this long. So I want to thank you for being here, and I would like all of us to give our visiting teams a round of applause for their presence here. I also want to thank those who are in attendance, and especially the press. Thank you for being here. Thank you for covering this event. Your work is extremely important. I'm honored to host, on behalf of the United States, together with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and Education International. And it's wonderful to be joined by excellent partners in the U.S. delegation. Randy Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers, who, as we speak, is testifying before Congress. She'll be joining us later. We have Becky Pringle, the President of the largest teacher union, the National Education Association. And Carissa Moffett-Miller, CEO of the Council of Chief State School Officers, is here. Thank you to the team from the United States. Not only are they partners in the U.S. delegation, they are trusted co-conspirators in this work to improve public education in the United States of America. Thank you to all of you from around the world who have joined us here today. I have to say, we're looking forward to the formal events, but some of the informal events were just as good. Last night we had dinner with the ministers. I had dinner with the ministers, and let me tell you, it was such a great opportunity for me to engage and get to know them as people and share common interests. I learned the focus in Singapore is to help children discover, distill, and discern information, right? From Costa Rica, I learned the importance of making sure we're looking out for the whole child. And when we talk about reopening schools, we're thinking about the social emotional well-being of our students as well. I learned from Ukraine that they're very close. They're working really hard. They're very close to outsmarting ChatGPT. And I think we learned as a world, never bet against Ukraine. So my money's on them. And I was even able to take a wonderful selfie with China. with the Capitol in the background. So anything is possible, and I'm really thankful for your presence here as well. In the United States, I often say we need to raise the bar for education. The countries you represent are here because in one way or another, you are raising the bar. So as head of the U.S. delegation, let me be clear. We approach this summit with both pride in our strengths, but also humility in our struggles. We know we can, and we will, learn so much from your examples. Today, as we begin the 13th International Summit on the Teaching Profession, we face a world that is courageously rebounding from the tragic disruption of a global pandemic and its impact on our young people. At the same time, over the last 3 years, the challenges and the opportunities we see in education have evolved. I recently traveled to Zambia in Africa to attend the Summit for Democracy. I know South Africa's here. Where are you? South Africa. Thank you for being here. When I traveled to Zambia, the event was beautiful. At the hotel in Zambia, I spotted 3 gazelles roaming close by. That reminded me of a metaphor I share that is based off the African gazelle. I learned that in the African savanna, gazelles and their young face danger from all around. So they do something very smart. When they're together, they sit in a circle with each gazelle facing outward. They do this to form an alert circle. Together, they can see any danger that's coming from any direction, 360 degrees. And one gazelle can quickly alert the others. When I used this example at the height of the pandemic, I pointed out that many of us in many countries were forming our own alert circles around our children. Teachers, unions, education leaders, medical professionals, governments alike recognized the dangers of an unprecedented crisis. And by coming together like gazelles, we worked our best to protect our young people. Today, forming an alert circle remains part of our function in coming together from all over the world. In our summit sessions, we'll all benefit from each other's perspectives on risks and challenges you see the students in your country facing. In the session on leveraging digital technologies, for example, perhaps we'll hear some concerns about the impact of social media on students' mental health. But as we move past the heights of the pandemic, we also need to think bigger than risks and recovery, to challenge complacency and push for transformative change at a time when the system has already been disrupted for us. If we return to the status quo, we are failing our students. So I hope over the next few days we can also form what I call an opportunity circle. Let's position ourselves with all of our different perspectives to get a better view together of the opportunities to reimagine our education systems for the better. In session 1, on elevating and enhancing the teaching profession, I'm looking forward to hearing from other countries that are doing bold and creative things to respect and support their teachers, helping us see the same opportunities in our own system. And finally, in addition to alert circles and opportunity circles, let's think of action circles. Let's do what ISTP has always done incredibly well and look at concrete ways we can act together to help our young people. When we have our session on educating for global and cultural competence and civic engagement, there are steps we can take to advance multilingual education together so our students have the language skills they need to engage with the rest of the world. Can we work together to make sure our students have more pathways? Can we do that? Yes, we can. When the United States started and hosted the first of these summits in 2011, no one knew that it would become a major annual event. Now we've reached the 13th summit, and we're just one of many different countries that have stepped up to host throughout the summit's history. Throughout that history, we've functioned as alert circles, opportunity circles, action circles. But whatever the need of the moment, the bottom line is this. We've come together, we've worked together, and we've raised the bar. Together, I know we can do this again and use this summit to drive the transformative change that will last. Our children are counting on us. Our teachers are counting on us. Our countries are counting on us. So let's get to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Cardona. And our next remarks are from another co-host, from the Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann, and his remarks are taped, and we'll play them now.
Dear First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, Secretary Miguel Cardona, ministers, union leaders, distinguished guests, friends all, a very warm welcome to this international summit of and for the teaching profession. The OECD is proud to have co-founded this summit, which is now in its 12th year, together with the United States and Education International. Thank you very much, Secretary Cardona, for hosting us this year. Your forward-looking initiative, Raise the Bar, Lead the World, which supports equitable access to quality education, is an excellent example of the investments in the future that will be discussed here today. Education and skills are fundamental to ensuring young people have the best possible opportunities to develop, to be the best they can be, to contribute, to participate, to get ahead, and yes, to benefit from the opportunities in front of them in our economies and societies. Access to high-quality education is what underpins the promise of merit-based social mobility and equality of opportunity in democratic nations. It empowers people to succeed, and it gives students the tools to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Indeed, profound and ongoing transformations are reshaping how we live, how we learn, and how we work. Digitalization is providing new tools that can massively enhance learning and tailor materials to students' individual needs. At the same time, it can also pose challenges for education systems that need to be carefully managed. For example, advanced artificial intelligence systems like Generative Pre-trainer Transformer 4 or GPT-4 are expected to be able to master literacy and numeracy tests within 3 years or sooner. This will dramatically affect job markets and the skills that are in demand. Some roles will change, others will be created, and others will disappear. For example, while artificial intelligence can automate certain tasks, there will also be enormous demand for those who can use it effectively, including by designing prompts to get the best outputs from a system like GPT-4. Schools can help students navigate this transition by teaching the skills needed to fully participate in this transformation and to benefit from it, and to be prepared for lifelong learning. Skills like adaptability, creativity, curiosity, and critical thinking. This can be fostered with lesson plans involving activities like designing a new product, solving big problems which require multidisciplinary perspectives, and indeed the arts. Meeting our sustainability objectives will also require a massive transformation of our economies. And education here also will play a key role in helping to prepare students for this. The OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment has found that there is a gap between student interest in climate change issues, which is very high, and a sense of empowerment to be part of the solution to those issues. Schools and teachers can foster students' sense of agency by demonstrating how individual decisions can help contribute to addressing our common sustainability challenges. Our education systems must also prepare students for the changing patterns of globalization, trade, and economic opportunities. This means, among other things, helping students become effective multilingual communicators, and classroom lessons focused on building intercultural understanding in increasingly diverse societies and economies. Aging societies in the majority of OECD countries also pose considerable challenges for labour markets and public services. Since 1960, the share of the population aged 65 and over across OECD countries has nearly doubled, and we expect it to increase further from 17.3% in 2019 to just under 27% by 2050. Education systems can help tackle this challenge by laying the groundwork for future productivity improvements, ensuring the skills are well aligned with future labour market requirements. They can also contribute to a culture change towards lifelong learning, which can help improve the employability of workers throughout their working lives and help address skill obsolescence among older adults. In order for our education systems to navigate these challenges, our work focuses on three priorities. First, rethinking the 20th century institution-based delivery of education. Outdated models of educating students in batches and training teachers only once make it difficult for education systems to adapt to our changing societies and labour markets. To this end, in last year's ministerial declaration on building equitable societies through education, our members called on the OECD to create and realise a bolder vision for education. We will work with governments, teachers and teacher unions to support innovation in schools and more personalised and engaging learning approaches. This includes work on flexible curricula, continuous teacher professional development and stronger public-private partnerships. Second, harnessing the potential of digital technologies and the green transition in education. The OECD has been pioneering work on artificial intelligence and other technologies in the classroom. For example, we've been supporting Korea's ambitious curriculum reform in 2022, which will strengthen digital skills at all ages, including on artificial intelligence, and provide new instruction on environmental and ecological issues. More broadly, we are identifying the types of skills students will need to thrive in the future through our Education and Skills 2030 project. And our unique indicators and surveys, the Programme for International Student Assessment and the Teaching and Learning International Survey, allow policymakers to assess and compare how students are being prepared for the digital and green transitions. Lastly, and importantly for today's discussion, empowering teachers to enable the necessary transformation of our education systems. In our last Teaching and Learning International Survey, which covered 48 jurisdictions, 3/4 of teachers indicated that their work environment discourages innovation by limiting autonomy and failing to reward creative thinking. Changing this environment and incentivizing innovation is the most promising way to address the teacher shortage crisis. The OECD's new work on policies for future-ready teachers provides practical policy guidance on making the teaching profession more attractive. Specifically, teachers will need tailored resources, training, autonomy, trust, recognition for success, and policy support for taking risks and generating new ideas. In closing, teachers have such a central role to play in helping students and ultimately our economies and societies adapt to profound structural changes like the twin digital and green transformations of our economies and our societies. Well-designed education policies can enable teachers to fulfill this role by encouraging innovation, by investing in technology, and by updating their approach to learning. This year's summit resolution is a fantastic opportunity to drive our collective ambition and set a course for a more effective, more creative, and more future-ready education system. I wish you positive, productive, and enjoyable discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Kornman. And next we will hear from our third partner in the ISTP, which is Susan Hopgood, the President of Education International. Susan?
Thanks very much, Maureen. Let me begin by thanking Secretary Cardona, and our Education International member organisation hosts the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Your warm and generous hospitality and hard work is much appreciated. I also want to commend our staff at EI and the Department of Education, NEA, AFT and the OECD. This event, our 13th global gathering, is grounded in cooperation and collegiality, and we are only able to sit here today because that spirit has guided the planning and logistics teams over the past year. To our colleagues and ministry and government counterparts from around the world, our sincerest appreciation for your presence. The attendance of so many full delegations shows an enduring commitment to common sense actions unions and governments can take together to advance the education of all students. And speaking of commitment, special thanks to Andreas Schleicher for leadership of these past dozen, now a baker's dozen, of international summits. The shared commitment of leaders in this room is, of course, also a shared sense of urgency. This year marks the midpoint of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the unanimous commitment of all governments to set the world on a course of sustainable development by 2030. Unfortunately, we already know that the education goal is badly off track. Hundreds of millions of the most vulnerable children, young people and adults remain excluded from education. Millions more are in school but without adequate environments, trained teachers or educational resources. Predictions are that by 2030, only 6 in 10 young people will be completing secondary education. Meanwhile, the estimated annual financing gap to reach the ambitions of Goal 4 has grown to nearly $200 billion US. We know that education status is a national bellwether. It tells us most precisely the prospects for children, the health status of the population, the income and civil rights of women, the likelihood of innovation and entrepreneurship, and its ability to respond and adapt to crises, including conflict, climate change and natural disaster. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed recently referred to these events as multiple interconnected cascading crises that demand immediate action. One prominent and crucial thread runs through these intersecting crises, and that is a lack of funding. Education systems in many countries have fewer resources than at any time in history, falling in 65% of low and middle income countries and in 33% of upper middle and high income countries since the start of the pandemic. So unfortunately, at a time when we know that tens of millions of new teachers need to be hired globally, global financing agencies block teacher recruitment and salaries, further depleting the core of professional educators. But the shortage of professional teachers is the perfect storm for millions of every income level. UNESCO reported before the pandemic that nearly 70 million new teachers would be needed by 2030. Post-pandemic reports of shortages are coming from my own country of Australia, from the United States, Great Britain and France, just to name a few. Concern over the status of the teaching profession led the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in September to announce a high-level experts panel on teachers to address and reverse the global teacher shortage by examining issues like compensation, working conditions, lack of autonomy, resources and support. We are especially pleased that the head of the Secretariat for the UN Teachers Panel, Hutan Hamayunpur, is with us to incorporate the lessons from ISTP into their deliberations and recommendations. At EI, we are mobilising to connect the crisis in funding to the sustainable world we want to create. Our global campaign, Go Public, Fund Education, unites our 383 member organisations in 178 countries and their 32 million members in the fight for publicly funded education and resourcing the public sector to build inclusive, quality public education for all. And as we mobilise for resources, we also recognise the need for a collaborative and cooperative approach to solving the teacher shortage crisis, to ensuring an education workforce that is prepared and poised for the future, as we say in the call to these sessions. The future came early for our schools, didn't it? It was not an exaggeration to hear among the education metaphors during the pandemic that teachers were, in effect, rebuilding the plane as it flew, adjusting their work and their lives at a time of upheaval and uncertainty for themselves and their students. There's no less urgency today, but there are lessons that each of us took from our experiences these past few years that frame key questions for us to approach as a community. Tens of millions of new teachers are needed. What exactly is the profession they are being recruited to? What did we learn about professional development, about well-being, about compensation and resources and work environments? If you're across the table from a young person considering a career in teaching, or a veteran educator reconsidering his or her choice, what do you tell them? What is imperative? The environment for truth has certainly changed over the past several years. Democracy and representative governments is under assault across the world. Is it possible for educators and education system authorities to work together on strategies to prepare learners for civic engagement? In a world where authoritarians depend on disinformation and civic illiteracy, what can the education community do to strengthen these ethic and institutions of truth-telling? Whatever we do, we know that much of it will take place on screens, and the eyes of those on those screens will be those of our students. For too long now, educators and education systems have been merely customers in the steady march of tech into our classrooms, not developers, advisors, piloters, or partners. As a result, education technology at scale is largely untested, unregulated, and unproven. Can we together, governments, teacher organisations, schools and communities actually come together on this? Can we bridge the digital divide? Can there be a common vision for using digital technologies in all our schools? Can we envisage principles for the equitable and effective use of AI in education? Nurturing and enhancing democracy, promoting peace and sustainability, and supporting civic engagement in a diverse and independent world. There are no more compelling topics than those which we will engage these few days. Certainly, there is no more ambitious agenda. Colleagues, thank you once again for being here. And thanks in advance for being frank, for being open with each other, and for being focused on real change and real solutions for our students.
Thank you very much, President Hopgood. And we have heard from our three opening speakers and from the welcoming remarks the urgency of what we face in each of our countries and around the world on education for equitable societies. And we heard about the challenges and the opportunities. And that's really giving us a great start to what we're going to do over the next day and a half. What I'm going to do next is talk a little bit about what we see as progress happening in countries who attended the ISTP last year and made certain commitments and have now reported back on those commitments. So some of you here are new to ISTP or didn't attend last year, so there isn't a progress report. But among all of the other countries, we received reports from each of you about what it is that you have done with respect to the commitments you made last year. And I think this is a very good example of the action circle that Secretary Cardona mentioned. It is a circle from last year to this year. It's actions and actions that countries are each planning to take. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of what we see as the trends in those reports. And we will put the individual country reports up on the ISTP landing page so people can see what each of us in our countries has done over the past year. What the presentation I'm going to do now was prepared by Anthony McKay and his team in anticipation of coming here. And it is a good look at what we see happening across and pulling out common themes across the different countries. So basically, we see actions happening in each of the ISTP countries about elevating teachers, very concrete action, about empowering learners, and about leveraging technology. All of that geared towards equitable and inclusive, future-oriented education systems. And what we see is that countries are continuing to do some things, and they are moving to forge ahead in other areas. So it's continuing to move ahead and improve on what you're doing, and moving to another level, to the transformative stage, and to another whole level of what we're doing in education. So in what we see in the reports about continuing is that countries are continuing to strengthen professional learning and to add opportunities for teachers to conduct research and to advance professionally. We also see that countries are improving sustainability and culturally relevant pedagogy into teaching and learning to empower all learners, and embedding digital skills into curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and credentialing, all related to the topics that we're going to discuss here and topics we discussed last year. So countries are continuing to do that, to do it better, to delve more deeply, again, geared towards equitable and inclusive, future-oriented education systems. But at the same time, and this is consistent with what we've heard from many people about moving ahead after COVID, you need to not just go back to where you were when the education system was when COVID started, but to move ahead, to build back better. And that's the forging ahead piece that we see countries working on. And in this case, it's collaborating with teachers to reimagine the profession and to redefine how professional learning happens. We've heard mention of this in several of the presentations today. And it's also supporting agency for students to engage as global citizens and problem solvers. So education for global and cultural competence is arranged so that students become active, engaged learners and active, engaged participants in civic society. And the last is redesigning the education experience by leveraging technology to foster deeper learning and prepare learners for transition into the new economy, and that is all learners. Throughout all of this, this is a high-quality education for all students. And I'm going to mention just a couple of examples of the things that countries reported that are behind these trends that Tony summarized. So one is the United States is supporting recruiting, retaining, and diversifying the teaching profession, including by creating teacher apprenticeships and investing in teacher pipelines. Finland is equipping students with global competencies to empower them to address complex global challenges and opportunities. And Singapore is introducing a guide to e-pedagogy, strengthening professional learning around digital skills, and encouraging teachers to support each other in developing new technology-enabled lessons. And Spain has developed a national plan for digital skills, a framework for creating a digital education ecosystem, and improving the digital skills of teachers, students, and all schools. These are just a couple of the concrete examples that countries have identified of work over the past year in elevating and enhancing the teaching profession, in moving forward to stronger education systems for equitable societies. There are, as I mentioned, a report from each of the countries, which we are available if people would like to see them, that summarizes for each country what they had been working on since last year. Again, this is the action circle. This is what we talk about having a continuity between the summits, a continuity and a push for real action to occur in each country based on what we're learning around the table from each other and from our partners. So we're going to continue this work over the next two days. We're going to continue about looking at how do we forge ahead, how do we elevate to the next level, how do we build back better after COVID rather than to the same spot. So thank you very much for that. And next, we will hear from OECD and from Education International about their background reports. Each year, OECD does a report that provides analysis and data that focus on the topics that are being discussed in the ISTP this year. So Andrea Schleicher will walk us through some of the important pieces of data and information about the topics for this year. And there are copies of the reports on each of your seats. So please, over to Andrea Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills at the OECD.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and I want to thank you, Secretary Cardona, for your leadership in making this happen, and also my colleagues from Education International for many years of very fruitful partnerships. Social partnership never falls from the sky. It needs to be renewed. It needs to be re-energized every day, and I think the ISTP sets a really, really good example how we can foster that at the international level now. But we live in very challenging times, Secretary Cardona. You have outlined this already. Chat, GPT, and the likes have reminded us that the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate now. Too often we educate young people for our past, not for their future. Now, at the OECD, we have been tracking how systems like ChatGPT fare on global tests like PISA and our PIAC assessment of adult skills. And when we did that first in 2016, you see that here, AI could figure out all of the easy tasks at level 1, not surprisingly, about 3/4 of tasks at level 2, which is about basic literacy, and it could solve about 20% of the more complex problem-solving tasks. And that's not so different from the adult population in OECD and ISTP countries here. But when we repeated that exercise in 2021, AI beat most humans at every level now. And for 26, AI is likely to solve 8 out of 10 of the most complex tasks at level 4. Now, while for humans, we predict the OECD average to be more like, 2 out of 10. So the advent of AI pushes us to think much harder about what makes us human. Now, we know how to educate second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we told them. But, what is going to make us successful in this new world? What is our human differentiator? And I guess figuring that out is why we are here at this ISTP now. And what can give us confidence is seeing governments and teacher unions, working here together on a bolder vision of how we can, reimagine the places, the people, the time, the technology, and most importantly, the relationships in education for a different future. Secretary Cardona, I'm really glad you've put global and intercultural competency on the agenda for this ISTP. It's the first time it features. And for many countries, it's become really an important issue to help students be better prepared for the times of polarizations in which we live, economic, social, political, even cultural polarization. Another topic for this ISTP is how we can better leverage digital technologies to make learning more engaging, more relevant, more inclusive. No? And of course, none of this is going to happen if we cannot elevate the teaching profession. And that's our first topic here. And some countries do face dire teacher shortages. No? But in other countries, the teaching profession is still a very attractive career choice. Let's not forget that either. And that makes our ISTP here so rich and interesting. No? And these differences among countries are not simply explained by material conditions. No? Here you see the teacher salaries relative to what other college graduates earn. So where the bars are green, teachers earn more than other college graduates. Where the bars are red, teacher pay is not competitive. No? And you can see that Luxembourg pays its teachers best, but Luxembourg still faces huge teacher shortages. No? In Finland, salaries are quite low, and yet, they have 10 applicants queuing up for every teaching post. So money only gets you so far. If you want to make teaching attractive, you have to think well beyond the material environment. And that's not the end of the story, actually. We also see no clear relationship between salaries here on the vertical axis and whether teachers think they made a good choice to become a teacher. No? You see that here on the horizontal axis. No? Korean teachers are paid well, and they say teaching was a great choice. No? That's what you would expect. No? But Portuguese teachers are also paid well, no? And they think teaching really was a bad choice. No? American teachers are paid poorly and say teaching was a good career choice. No? And French teachers are paid poorly and are unhappy with teaching. So it's all over the place. No? It is all over the place. You cannot look at the attractiveness of teaching with money and material conditions. So what all of this say is that money only gets you so far. Poor salaries are obviously an extrinsic demotivator, very clearly so. But money is rarely an intrinsic motivator for people working in education. A much more telling figure is the social status of teachers. You can see that in Singapore, Korea, or Finland, about 2/3 of teachers feel their work is valued by society. No? But in Sweden, in France, in the Slovak Republic, it's only 1 in 20. No? And that really matters, because what makes a job attractive is always a combination of the social status of the job, what the contribution that people feel they can make to society and in the job, and the extent to what their work is both financially and intellectually rewarding. No? And when you look at the countries that succeed to attract great people into teaching, you'll find consistently 3 factors that make them stand out. First is they put structures in place that publicly elevate the standing of teachers. The basic principle is that every interaction that teachers have with their communities builds and banks social capital. That's the most fundamental principle. So high-performing systems organize the work of teachers so that teachers get to know their students really, really well, and they publicly support them to make a difference every day in their communities with families. No? And teachers with engagement with families and communities in those countries is always asset-driven, never kind of deficit-driven, just focusing on troubleshooting and so on. And where partnership with transparency becomes a paradigm of accountability, you win the trust of society, and that is the energy that elevates the public standing of teachers. The second factor is about how we organize the work of teachers and the opportunities that teachers have for professional growth. Our Thales survey shows that there's often a large gap between what teachers study, you see that marked here in blue, for different areas, and how well they actually feel prepared. Now, that's the green bars. No? And there are areas where both investment in professional development and also preparedness are low. Now, you can see here, teaching in multicultural settings. We will come back to that. Or teaching with technology. No? Both the exposure, the teaching, the learning, and the preparedness are low in those areas. Now, what's the key here is that effective professional development is always continuous. It always includes practice and feedback, and it always provides good time for following up. No. Tallis also suggests that the greatest impact is with professional development that takes place actually in schools, at the front line, and it is always collaborative. And we know that great teachers want to work in schools with a culture of sharing. Our Tallis data show that there's a good amount of teacher collaboration, but it's often just about practical exchanges. You see that here on the left side. When you actually look at deep professional collaboration here on the right side, or what you, Secretary Cardona, called yesterday intentional collaboration, it is actually quite rare. And you see the bars on the right side getting a lot smaller now. And why this matters? Because the more teachers teach jointly as a team, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they take part in collaborative professional learning, the greater the sense of self-efficacy. These are the strongest predictors of what makes teachers confident in their own ability. But we need great teachers not just to raise standards, but also to strive for more ambitious educational goals. And that brings me to our second theme at the summit here. Globalization and technology have, connected people, cities, countries in a way that have vastly increased our individually and also our collective potential. That is the great thing. But the same forces have also made our world a lot more volatile, a lot more complex. And we see this growing disconnect between the infinite growth imperative and the finite resources of our planet. Susan, you alluded to this. Between, the financial economy and the real economy, between the wealthy and the poor, between what we call our gross domestic product and the well-being of people, between what is technologically possible and the social needs of people, between governance and the perceived voicelessness of many. If we want to see a different world, we'll need to build a different education system. And that depends on nothing more than what happens in today's classrooms. In our PISA study, 8 out of 10 students say that looking after the global environment is important to them. And they think of themselves as global citizens now. That is something we have achieved, but only 60% of 15-year-olds say they can do something about the problems of the world. Or what they do is going to make a difference for people in other places now. That is the dilemma. Helping students develop that curiosity, that agency, that compassion, that is what we need to ask from education today. At work and in our communities, people need a really good understanding of how other people live in different cultures, in different traditions, and how other people think, whether it's a scientist or as an artist. And we need to acknowledge that the foundations for that do not all come natural. We are all born with that kind of, bonding social capital. We feel a sense of belonging to our family or to people who have shared experiences, but it always takes deliberate effort, good education to build that bridging social capital that, we can share experiences with others, with people who are different from us, and increase our radius of trust to others. That does not come natural. That will only come through education. And a good start for that is learning languages. Research highlights huge cognitive benefits of learning a foreign language for first language literacy, but also for creativity, for mental alertness, lots of things that are actually quite surprising. And the economic benefits of learning languages are also quite well understood. Even, popular magazines these days talk about the salary bonuses that come with foreign language skills. So that story is actually quite well documented. But the most important are the ways in which languages foster actually openness to other ways of thinking, openness to other cultures. And most school systems have actually taken this to heart, With the exception of a couple of countries on the right side of the chart, you can see now 3/4 of 15-year-olds learning at least one, and often actually 2 languages at school. Now that's the blue part. So there's been a lot happening in getting students exposed to language learning now. Some people say Europe has always been good at language learning, but when you look at Europe 20 years ago, you could see just very few countries starting with foreign languages at the age of 6 or below when it's really effective. Those are the ones that I've marked in blue here. No? Well, you look at this now, and you can see actually the map has largely turned blue. Now, research tells us it's those young ages when we learn languages best, and that is really something that has progressed enormously. No? Teaching children and youth to learn languages. And PISA shows that every country for which we have data, where people speak more than one language, they are more positive to taking different perspectives, even after accounting for social background. These are very, very strong effects between learning a language and feeling to be open to the world. And interestingly also, students who speak multiple languages show greater interest and respect for people from other cultures, and also a greater ability to understand the perspectives of different people. You can see really how those interconnections are at work, and there is a lot more than schools can do beyond, language teaching. According to school principles in PISA, the most common activities to support global competencies are lessons on the customs of cultural groups and learning about historical and social events. A lot less common are celebrations of festivities of other cultures and student exchanges here at the bottom of the chart. And I'm saying that because it's actually not the lessons, but it's always the experiences that show the largest difference and effect on student attitudes and behavior. Not what you do in content, but actually how students experience this. And unfortunately, they're the least frequent. But, countries vary a lot on this. Virtually all schools in Singapore or Slovenia offer school exchanges with other countries. That's actually become a quite important part of public policy in those countries. And Singapore also leads when it comes to celebrating festivities of different cultures. You see that rarely happening in Italy or Switzerland here. So you can see actually a lot of variability across countries, but it is those active participation in different cultures that changes and drives student behavior. So all of this matters. The PISA data show that the more global activities schools offer, the more interested students are in learning about other cultures. The highest bar here. The more they feel awareness and agency. And the greater their ability to take different perspectives and many, many positive outcomes that really come from this active engagement of schools in global competencies. Global citizens are not born. They're actually developed through those kinds of activities, and schools can make an enormous contribution through those kinds of factors. Now, of course, it's one thing to put that into your school curriculum. It's quite another to get teachers ready for that, and that's, what our ISTP is about. And, generally, I must say, teachers hold very strong multicultural beliefs, particularly in Singapore, Ireland, and Ukraine. But, teachers often say that teaching in multicultural and multilingual settings is actually one of the toughest challenges they face. And it's getting tougher every day because our societies are becoming more diverse. And as you can see here, teaching in multicultural settings doesn't rank particularly high in teacher training. This is the yellow bar here. Just about a third of teachers were trained to teach in multicultural settings. But 9 out of 10 experience that every day. So there is a gap between the situations teachers face and their preparedness. So if we want to see learning that is relevant, deep, transformational, connected with the world, we need to ensure that teachers understand their students and their learning in context, and that teachers are encouraged to bring their own informal experiences and perspectives into the interactions with their students. Now, teachers come with their own background, with their own kind of ideas, and to bring that alive is a very powerful way to actually get students involved. And getting that right is important. It's always the societies, that value pluralism, which can draw on the best talent from anywhere in the world, and they are best positioned to nurture kind of creativity and innovation. I already touched on the power of technologies, our third topic. Just very briefly, one thing is very clear, during the pandemic, schools woke up to the digital world that has, radically transformed learning experiences, and technology hasn't just helped, maintain learning during the pandemic. In parts, it's really transformed it. And the most visible benefit has been greater personalization, while you study mathematics on the computer can now figure out how you learn and then make your learning experiences a lot more granular, a lot more adaptive, a lot more interactive, serving also better, students with special needs and so on. Digital learning games have made learning a lot more fun, and simulations let you do things that are usually difficult or sometimes costly to do in the real world. No? Why would you listen to your teacher explaining to you the result of an experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory? Sort of lots of opportunities here. Augmented reality, super empowering the real world in vocational settings, great examples. And well, the only way you don't learn a foreign language is by having, a teacher talk about grammar and vocabulary. And now you can see actually robot tutors becoming quite good at helping students learn a language through interaction. We also have seen, robots becoming quite effective as peer learners. Explaining what you know to somebody else turns out often a better way to reinforce your own understanding than having just listening to someone explaining things to you. So there are actually really interesting ways. And we're also seeing big leaps in assessment. One of the greatest mistakes in the history of education that we made was to divorce learning from assessment. We ask students to pile up years and years and years of learning, and then one day we pull them back and say, well, tell me everything that you know in a very contrived and short setting, and we call that an exam. Well, nowadays with technology, we can reunite learning and assessment, giving students that much more granular, direct feedback to learn better, teachers to teach better, and schools to become more effective. No? And then, learning analytics hold perhaps the greatest promise here. Teachers can now get a real sense how different students learn differently, understand sometimes some of their own biases by getting, more objective data on this. And so teachers actually can get a better sense how students learn and where they need extra support. Lots of opportunities. Well, we talked about all of that for years. The pandemic has sort of made it real, at least for those who were ready. But we should also not get ahead of ourselves. PISA data show clearly that technology in classrooms still often relates negatively to learning outcomes. Not just cognitive, but also negatively to social and emotional outcomes. And that's not necessarily a bad reflection on technology. It could well be a reflection on our capacity to use it poorly. Now, the reality is often that we have a patchwork of digital solutions in schools. Schools have to rely on proprietary and incompatible partial solutions, and when schools make different choices, they can't harness the data to help students learn better, teachers teach better. That is unfortunately still very much the reality with which teachers struggle every day. And the most important lesson here is really this. There is no technical solution that is going to work unless teachers are at the heart of their design. Now, where you don't engage teachers in the research and design around technology, don't expect them to help you with implementation. One of the lessons I think learned from all of this as well. Smart education is not about technology. It's always about a radical reimagination of what teaching and learning can be when powered by technology. We need to shift attention from the learning technology to the learning activity and better integrate individual, team, class-based activities with digital environments. The hardware needs to evolve so that devices are more present but less visible, less destructive. Distracting. And we need smart systems that work for everyone, that have equity integrated at their core, not somehow bolted on. We need to see that artificial intelligence empowers learners and teachers rather than disempower them. If you don't understand an algorithm, you're going to be soon the slave of that algorithm. And technologies cannot replace teachers because learning is always a social enterprise, not a transactional business. So I think we need to take that to heart and build the environments around this. And this is where technologies can actually be so strong. And what you can do as ministers and union leaders is to cultivate a more innovation-friendly ecosystem through setting better standards with well-thought-out regulations, with a focus on transparent, explainable, bias-free, and socially negotiated applications. That is our task to do, to create an environment for for technology to become meaningful. Now also strategic funding, procurement, big homework to do through capacity investments and by having teachers and students co-create smart, user-friendly, affordable, open, and interoperable edtech tools. And this is another agenda where OECD and Education International are working together as well to see to what extent we can come up with shared principles on this. At the moment, we see that tsunami of technology coming, but education is actually maybe even less prepared than for the pandemic, for a virus. And that brings me to the very last point, digital citizenship. Here you see the share of 15-year-olds who were highly effective navigators in the digital world. They can distinguish fact from opinion, they can integrate different perspectives, navigate kind of different information sources, and you can see even in the best performing education systems. Now look at Singapore, Korea, parts of China, but just talking about half of 15-year-olds capable of navigating the digital world. Now they have all their tablets and smartphones and so on, but they have difficulties with the human, the cognitive skills underpinning this. And the other half are also born in the digital world, but in most countries they are not digital natives. You can say that humans have always been better to invent new things than to use them wisely, but never before had this had so direct consequences in the real world. Let's include the voices of students. Students are always the most untapped resource on this planet, and they're always at the frontier of this. And let's support our teachers as learners and build the kind of work organization that helps them co-create more innovative learning environments. And let's see parents and the communities, not as clients or consumers of education, but as the energy that fuels learning. And let's think through what public-private partnerships really mean for the protection of education as a public good. And that brings me back to right where we started, empowering teachers to reimagine and redesign the places, the people, the technologies, and the relationships to make sure that we educate learners for their future, not for our past. And the ISTP here is the obvious place to get this done. Thank you very much.
Andreas, you provided us many pieces of data and analysis for food for thought and to factor into our discussions about social status of the teachers, how you use technology, what it means to be globally and culturally competent. So thank you, and you also showed how the three topics are very much interrelated. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is John Banks, consultant to Education International, and he will talk about some of the issues in the EI briefing document. So over to you, John.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to use this first slide as a little bit of an opportunity to promote the future of the International Summits of the Teaching Profession. I was just thinking, Maureen, about the excellent US-hosted seminar yesterday, actually. It really worked. And I was thinking about the number of summits that we'd had over the years, for instance, New York, Amsterdam, Wellington, Banff, Berlin, Edinburgh, Lisbon, Helsinki. And then we had the virtual summit in the height of COVID that ourselves and OECD organised, and the virtual one in Washington as well. Now we're back here. And I just want to maybe raise a little bit of raise a veil on the organisation of summits, because I want to encourage, and I know Andreas does as well, future hosts for the summit. First of all, both Education International and the OECD, as the permanent summit partners, do everything they can to ensure that the host has a successful summit. Secondly, I would say, and it's lovely to see the Spanish delegation here, after 2.5 years interrupted by COVID of trying to get that summit on the road in Valencia, they did. And I know colleagues in Spain have felt that there has been a continuing echo, really positive echo from that summit. And it's been the same with other summit organisers as well. So I'm just going to sort of trail that as a potential was for, looking at future summit hosts as we move into the, as it were, the late 20s. The other thing I do want to say, and it's something that Andreas picked up, and I'm really grateful he did, and that is the issue of social partnership. Now, I mean, I said yesterday that actually I don't think social partnership is simply trade union leaders and ministers getting together of what we used to call beer and sandwiches. I do think it's actually about the essence of pluralism, and that is respecting difference and respecting points of agreement and going as far as you can on those points of agreement. And that has absolutely been the essence of the summits itself, actually. And finally, before I move on to my slides, I've always said to myself, what do you do about Andrus's presentations? And all I can say is, don't even try to compete. Because they're so technically brilliant. Oh, actually, I want to say something else about OECD data, and I've said this all the years I've been special advisor to EI. The point about OECD data is that it's teachers' data as much as governments. And I've always seen it as that. It has been absolutely invaluable. Now, there are some academics who actually take a default position about OECD data and say, oh, you know, this is this great behemoth that actually produces all this data and it's theirs and we can't possibly compete. It's complete rubbish, actually. The data is ours, and I've always said that about PISA as much as TALIS. It's ours to interpret. And I would say to OECD, some of those attempts that you made on some of the previous PISAs to get teachers who had been involved together in terms of meetings and conferences were really good, and maybe that's worth having another look at. So having had that enormously long preamble, I'm going to move on to my... right, okay.
It's this one.
Oh, it's this one, right, okay. Look, I tell you what, I became famous, actually, in UK circles when I talked to the Education Select Committee and said that I didn't do death by PowerPoint. Anyway, there you go. I am now doing death by PowerPoint. Okay, this is the first slide, and I was really struck, actually, by this. It's one of the most forthright statements that I've seen from a global institution, OECD, about the power of education to create stable and good societies. And it's from the OECD's discussion document for its recent education ministerial. And as expectations of a profession go, they couldn't be higher. It also implies that it's simply not possible to create an effective teaching profession without creating equally effective background conditions. So what are they? And I actually thought it would be really worth sitting down and working out where we'd reach points of agreement based on evidence about what are the background conditions of any education system if you really want a very highly effective and efficacious teaching profession. So what are the necessary system conditions? Now, I mean, some of them appear to be bland, like education must be a top policy priority of the governments, but I have to say, actually, that there are one or two points I do want to pick up. I think our efforts must be redoubled to make education a top policy priority, and I don't think it's a given. I think this was as much a concern amongst ministers at the OECD's ministerial education meeting there just before Christmas as it was amongst EI member organisations. I know a number of countries here have had highly effective post-COVID recovery strategies, but are they being continued to be sustained, for example? And can countries be confident that their education provision is coherent, systemically, and based on trust, collaboration, and the needs of communities? And to achieve this must be a continuing background theme for our own summits. And so, what are the other necessary system conditions? I think there's been great progress in the summits on the themes of excellence, equity, and inclusion, and Finland's focus in the 2019 summit on the vital need for quality early years education for all children as a springboard for later efficacy in learning was a great example. It does echo with me, that example. As was the focus at the 2016 summit in Berlin on meeting the needs of children of refugees and asylum seekers. Yet despite the valiant efforts at our New Zealand summit to raise the issue of disadvantage, I think there's a continuing need to focus more on practical strategies to meet the needs children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds especially have now, particularly now post-COVID and given the economic crisis. And you'd expect me to say that, and that's why the ISTP is so vital. There is a strong correlation, and this is the big key issue that came up in 2011. There's a strong correlation between highly effective education systems and strong proactive teacher unions. We first came together on that understanding in 2011, and it's an understanding that's even more true now. So, what are the necessary teacher policy conditions? Now, teacher policy is something that I think is still, the notion of teacher policy is not really as embedded as it might be. But without coherent teacher policy, education systems can't be confident that they're effective. And this is where I think we're on the conditions for this is why we're focusing on conditions for effective teacher policies. The last two summits, our US-hosted virtual summit in 2021 and our Spanish-hosted summit, made great progress in an area where I think it previously felt like a roadblock. It's the relationship between student and teacher well-being and the education of the whole child. Two conditions have contributed to this becoming centre stage, apart from economic disadvantage. A realisation that school communities are vital in creating optimistic agency amongst students in the face of existential crises, and secondly, that schools must make sense of the digital explosion. And if students need optimistic agency, so do teachers, which is where the importance of creating the conditions for teacher leadership come in. Every teacher should feel that their professional knowledge is respected and taken into account. And the importance of teacher learning and the need for teachers to have creative control of the curriculum, I think, is unarguable. The summits have consistently focused on the implications of schools in their communities, as our Portuguese summit did, for example, and it's a rich area for future policy development. We could focus more on the relationship of the teaching profession to other teaching professions, take pay and compensation, for example. A major contribution to teacher attrition appears to be that when there are significant disparities between teachers' pay and that of other professions, then you're in trouble. Now, I listened very carefully to Andrew's comments about teachers' pay just now, and I absolutely agree that actually if we're looking at the whole child, we need to look at the whole teacher as well. I mean, I absolutely agree with that, and that's what you were doing. But, you know, the last Education at a Glance, 2022, did make it clear that the average pay of teachers across the OECD was between 4 and 14% lower than equivalent tertiary education workers, tertiary education workers. And I do think, I mean, there are some pinch points in pay across the OECD and other countries. And a number of member organisations are in conflict with their governments over that. And I wish some of them were here, by the way, because we could have had some decent conversations. But what I would say about pay is it may not be everything, but boy, does it help. And I have to say, President Biden's remark to the State of the Union, when he was doing his State of the Union address, when he said, let's give public sector workers a raise, was really welcome. So we move on to, come on, here we go. Right, education for global competence and engagement. The global challenges are immense, not least from those listed above. As last year's summit affirmed, schools are almost unique in having the role of instilling optimistic agency in students. It's this role which makes schools integral to keeping societies together, and it's why education for global and cultural competence and civic engagement are so important. It has the power to enhance trust, mutual respect, support, collaboration, and inclusive values amongst students because it is outward facing to the world. And I think it's, there we are. And then we move to how can education contribute to global collaboration. Now, I mean, there are 3 points here teaching global competencies, education for global citizenship, and education for democracy. And this plenary's theme, this particular theme, is entirely new, and it's the only one entirely new to this summit. The other ones are really vital, but they're recapitulations. We're having a look at new developments in the other two themes. This one is new, and in fact, actually, it's two themes for the price of one. I think PISA's Volume 6 on global competencies is a real step forward. If it shows one thing, it is that students who are more likely to feel that they can take action to secure collective well-being and sustainable development are those who hold more positive intercultural attitudes. It's the core argument for teaching global competencies, that actually students acquire optimistic agency because they know what's going on in the world, and it does build optimistic agency in students. But there's also education for democracy. While there are many countries that have pluralistic democratic societies, there are many countries that don't. EI's 25 Lessons from the Teaching Profession emphasises how important it is that to teach about democratic values and global citizenship. It's vital for good societies, and it's vital for their economic well-being. Democratic, pluralistic societies can create a rich and fertile basis for innovation as well. But can teaching global competencies take place effectively without teaching democratic values? And I think Russia's aggression against the Ukraine has propelled us into a crisis about how actually democratic values can be enhanced. They need caring, they need constant attention, and we can't afford to walk away from it. So I thought it was worth putting up two views. This is from Education International. It's from the 25 Lessons that was released at our last Global Congress. Pedagogic and didactic methods imbued with democratic values should inform all teaching, irrespective of subject. But I thought the OECD's comment was really important as well, that actually you can have global competencies, but you shouldn't descend into cultural relativism. Respect and a belief in human dignity mark the importance of right and wrong and offer a counterweight to the risk that sensitivity to other viewpoints may descend into cultural relativism. I think this is a continuing debate. And to respond to that question, we profoundly believe that teaching about democracy and pluralism should be at the heart of education. And pluralism, being able to respect the views of others, even if you disagree with them, is the approach taken by the OECD in its introduction. Respect and belief in human dignity mark the importance of right and wrong. In short, I believe that teaching about global competencies and education for democracy are part of the same continuum, a part of the same spectrum, even if in some countries they don't overlap. They're both really important. So, what's the consequences of that? I actually do think there's a need for a radical rethink of the curriculum. Now, I know some people in the US say, well, we don't do curriculum at federal level. I know that. So don't worry about it. But I do think there is, at whatever level, it's worth having a look at the curriculum. And we do think that that role of innovation, that rethink, has to rest with teachers and their organisations. And these are the kind of things that ought to be thought about. Banks of successful practice, professional development, teacher supply, and yes, the role of independent trade unions. So we move on to the last theme, which is leveraging digital technologies to ensure equitable access and enhanced learning for all. Now, I put this up as a reminder of the discussions that we had in Spain last year about the pedagogical potential for digital education. They were really important questions, particularly about the role of ethical frameworks and open education resources. The one thing that wasn't centre stage in Spain last year was artificial intelligence. Yet and I know Andreas has rightly said that actually we've been predicting it for ages. Yet with ChatGPT, it's now centre stage. There are enormous opportunities in education which AI can provide. But now more than ever, there's need for an ethical framework for its use. The important thing to remember is that humanity has choices. It took choices over biological weapons and chemical weapons. even though they're used illegally. And you have choices in relation to the impact of AI as well. And I noticed that even big tech companies like Google, as well as a whole set of other actors, have called for a pause in AI development while such a framework is worked out. And I have to say, a big contribution to this framework has been the OECD's Council's Principles for Artificial Intelligence. They were published in 2019, and there's a very, very important quote there, which is Principle 1.2, which you see up there, about what should be included within such a framework: freedom, dignity, autonomy, privacy and data protection, non-discrimination, and equality, diversity, fairness, social justice, and internationally recognized labor rights. I don't know, I couldn't put that better, actually. I think it's exactly what we should be focusing on. One other big area, well, I'd say actually just about AI, I don't think it's inherently good or inherently bad. In education, as Andres says, it has a power to radically shift assessment away from knowledge recall as a basis of examination to placing teachers squarely at the centre of evaluating understanding and creativity. So I think there's potential there, but we need to have a look at the ethical framework. The other big area that's worth exploring is the impact of blockchain ledgers and virtual currencies. Financial literacy doesn't come into it. The storing of financial and other information over countless hubs has enormous implications, and it's another area that has significant implications for the curriculum. So what about where we go? Now, I mean, all of us in EI valued the ability to come up with a joint statement that we published in April 2021. And these are proposals that are taken from that in relation to technology. The OECD and EI's principles for effective and equitable educational recovery. And we discussed those in Spain last year, and they're still good. And some of those proposals there were discussed, but and I know some countries in their country objectives have been moving on those proposals. But I noticed that, as I say, those actions have taken place, but we need to do much, much more. And finally, this is something that I do think is important, that needs to be absolutely inscribed all the time, and that is, if digital technology, including AI, is to be used in the service of humanity, then it must be at the service of education. I do think that EI and OECD's joint principles set out a roadmap for putting those partnerships in place. And watch this space, by the way, in the third session, as Andreas hinted. What would government, union, teaching profession partnerships look like? I do think that the OECD's Global Education Industry Summits, to a certain extent, provided a model. And I think in the ISTPs we need to look at that and how we can actually look at having protocols built with technology providers, users and social partners. This year we have a golden opportunity to start discussions of how we put into place how those ethical principles can be put in place and how teachers can be engaged in the construction of robust digital platforms. And this session is really the opportunity to set out some practical objectives. So thank you very much, Summit. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You're our historian as well as our conscience, I think. So thank you very much for those thoughtful and provocative remarks for us moving ahead. So we're going to do a little exercise for everybody here now. We are going to ask each of you in your country to take 5 minutes and reflect on what you heard here. Whatever it is that resonated with you particularly that you'd like to have a 5-minute conversation on, please do that. And then, in the next 5 minutes, we would like you to turn to your neighbor, and I suggest you turn to the neighbor to your right, and have a conversation between your two countries for a few minutes, we'll make it 5 minutes, on what it is that you've raised. So this is a way to get you all interacting, and over to you for 10 minutes, and then we'll bring back the session and close.